Every single morning, rain, cold, no matter how bad his own life got, he still knocked on her door first.
Daniel, dear, good morning.
He was 30 days from losing everything Pod, and he still hadn't told anyone. She said he reminded her of the son she lost home, not to death, but to distance.
Here you go, Margaret.
Thank you, Daniel, you're a lifesaver. Something was wrong. She was never late to open that door. He knocked expecting his neighbor. The man who fired him opened the door instead.
If you've ever poured your last ounce of strength into helping someone else while your own world was falling apart, this story is for you. Stay until the very end, because what happens at that door will change the way you see every small act of kindness you'd ever offered a stranger. And if stories like this move you, hit that like button and subscribe now, because this channel is built for people who still believe that good things happen to good people, even when it takes the whole world to prove it. Daniel Reyes used to set 2 alarms every morning. The first one woke him at 5:15, before the sun had even considered rising over the rooftops of his quiet street. The second one at 5:30 was really just a formality, because by then he was already standing in the kitchen in his socks, brewing coffee he could barely afford, listening to the pipes groan in the walls of the small, rented house he shared with his 7-year-old son, Ethan. 6 months earlier, Daniel had been a logistics coordinator at Cole Freight and Distribution, a mid-sized company that shipped goods up and down the coast. He was good at his job. He showed up early, stayed late, memorized the names of every driver's kids, and never once called in sick, even the year he had walking pneumonia. But numbers on a spreadsheet don't care about loyalty. When the company's ownership changed hands and a new CEO took over with a mandate to streamline operations, Daniel's name appeared on a list of 40 employees let go in a single afternoon. He didn't even get to say goodbye to his desk. Security walked him out with a cardboard box holding a coffee mug, a photo of Ethan, and 6 years of his life folded into 11 minutes. He remembered standing in the parking lot that day, the box heavy in his arms, watching a black car with tinted windows pull away from the executive entrance. He never saw the CEO's face, just a shadow behind glass, gone before Daniel could feel angry enough to hate him properly. That night, he sat on the edge of Ethan's bed and told him everything was going to be fine, because that's what fathers do. He didn't tell Ethan about the notice they'd received from the landlord a week earlier, warning that another late payment would mean eviction proceedings. He didn't tell him about the 400 job applications he'd sent out in 6 months, or the interviews that went nowhere once his age and his gap in employment came up. He just tucked the blanket under his son's chin, kissed his forehead, and turned off the light so Ethan wouldn't see his father's eyes. It was around that time that Daniel started noticing Mrs. Bill Ellison. She lived 2 doors down, in a small house with peeling blue paint and a garden that had clearly once been beautiful, but had grown wild with neglect. Margaret Ellison was 79 years old, with silver hair she kept pinned in a loose bun, and a lavender cardigan she wore no matter the season. She moved slowly, leaning on a wooden cane with a brass handle worn smooth from decades of use. Daniel first spoke to her on a rainy Tuesday, when he saw her struggling to carry a bag of groceries up her porch steps, the paper bag darkening and threatening to split in the downpour. He hadn't thought twice. He jogged over, taken the bag from her arms, and carried it inside, while she thanked him with a surprised, grateful smile that seemed to say she wasn't used to people noticing her anymore. That should have been the end of it. A small kindness, forgotten by the next day. But Daniel kept thinking about her, about how her hands trembled slightly when she held the railing, about how her house, for all its faded charm, seemed impossibly quiet, as though no one had properly filled it with life in a very long time. The next morning, before he took Ethan to school, Daniel knocked on her door and asked if she needed anything from the store. She blinked at him like he'd spoken a foreign language, then laughed softly and said that in 11 years, no neighbor had ever asked her that. From that day on, It became part of his routine. Every morning, after dropping Ethan at school, Daniel walked to Mrs. Ellison's porch. Some days it was small things, bringing in her newspaper, changing a light bulb she couldn't reach, checking her mailbox. Other days it was bigger, driving her to a doctor's appointment when her scheduled ride canceled, fixing the loose step that had nearly caused her to fall twice, sitting with her for an hour just to talk because her husband had passed away 9 years earlier, and her only child, a son, had not called or visited in longer than she cared to admit. Daniel never asked for anything in return, and that was exactly why Margaret trusted him. In a world that increasingly seemed to trade kindness for convenience, he showed up anyway, day after day, even as his own circumstances grew more desperate. He didn't tell her about his job loss for weeks. It was Ethan, in his innocent way, who let it slip one afternoon while eating a cookie Margaret had baked, mentioning that Daddy had extra time now because the big shipping company said goodbye to him. Margaret's face had softened with understanding, and something else, a flicker of quiet anger on his behalf, though she said nothing about it that day. What she did instead was start leaving things for him. A container of soup because I made too much. An envelope with cash tucked inside, disguised as payment for babysitting Ethan on the days. School let out early, though everyone in that small exchange knew it was really just her trying to help without wounding his pride. Daniel always tried to refuse, and Margaret always insisted, and eventually they settled into an unspoken agreement. He would take care of her body, and she would try, in her own gentle way, to take care of his heart. Weeks passed. Daniel's savings thinned to almost nothing. He picked up whatever work he could find, hauling furniture for a moving company on weekends, doing yard work for 2 other neighbors, delivering food late into the night after Ethan was asleep, and a teenage babysitter from down the street could watch him for a few dollars an hour. Daniel could barely spare. He was tired in a way that went beyond the body, a bone-deep exhaustion that came from constantly being the one who held everything together while quietly falling apart himself. Yet every single morning, no matter how little sleep he'd gotten, no matter how bleak his bank account looked, he still walked to Margaret's porch. Some mornings it was the only part of his day that felt like it had meaning. Ethan would sometimes come along before school, and Margaret would slip him a butterscotch candy from a dish that never seemed to empty. And for those few minutes, Daniel could almost forget the weight pressing down on his chest. The job search, meanwhile, had become its own quiet war. Daniel spent his afternoons at the public library, using the free computers to fill out application after application, watching the little upload bar crawl across the screen as he attached the same resume for the 100th time. He learned the particular sting of automated rejection emails that arrived within minutes of Welch applying, as though a machine somewhere had glanced at his name and decided, without ever meeting him, that he wasn't worth a human's time. He learned the deeper sting of interviews that went well, that felt promising, that ended with a warm handshake and a promise to be in touch soon, followed by silence that stretched into weeks and then into nothing at all. He tried not to let any of it touch Ethan. He kept their evenings light, homework at the kitchen table, invented games with whatever was in the pantry, a nightly ritual of naming 3 good things that happened that day, even on days when Daniel had to dig deep to find even one. Ethan's 3 good things were always simple and unshakably honest. A good grade on a spelling test, a friend sharing their lunch, Mrs. Ellison's butterscotch candies. Daniel's were harder to find some nights, but he always managed, because he refused to let his son believe that hardship meant the world had stopped being good. There were setbacks that tested him in ways he hadn't expected. The car, an aging sedan that had carried them through years of school runs and grocery trips, began making a grinding sound that Daniel couldn't afford to diagnose, let alone fix. He drove it gingerly, avoiding highways, praying it would hold together long enough to get him through whatever came next. A part-time warehouse job finally landed, fell through in its 2nd week, when the company announced a hiring freeze. Each disappointment chipped away at him a little more. And yet each morning, the walk to Margaret's porch remained untouched, a fixed point in a world that otherwise seemed determined to keep shifting beneath his feet. Margaret noticed the toll it was taking on him, long before he ever said a word about it. She began finding small, tactful ways to ease his burden, without ever making him feel like a charity case, asking him to test a second helping of whatever she'd cooked, because she'd made too much again, insisting he take home the extra vegetables from a garden that, despite its wild edges, still produced more tomatoes and squash than one elderly woman could ever eat alone. She never once asked him directly if he was struggling. She simply made sure that, in the quiet corners of his day, he never had to struggle entirely alone. One afternoon in early autumn, as Daniel raked the last of the fallen leaves from Margaret's yard, she called him over to the porch and asked him to sit. Her expression was different that day, heavier, more distant, as though she were carrying a memory she rarely let herself touch. "I had a son," she said, watching a pair of sparrows hop along the fence. "Nathaniel. Brilliant boy. Too brilliant, maybe. He left for college and never really came back. Not in the ways that matter. He built himself a whole life out there. A big company, important people around him, more money than his father and I ever dreamed of. But somewhere along the way, he stopped calling. Stopped visiting. I used to think it was because he was busy. Now I think busy is just the polite word people use for forgetting." Daniel didn't know what to say, so he simply listened, the way he always did. "You remind me of him," Margaret continued, turning to look at Daniel with something like tenderness. "Not in how he is now, in how he used to be, before the world convinced him that being useful to strangers was worth more than being present for the people who loved him first." Daniel thought about that conversation for days afterward, though he couldn't have said exactly why it stayed with him. Perhaps it was because, in his own life, he was fighting so hard not to become a stranger to his own son, not to let hardship turn him distant or bitter or absent in spirit, even when he was present in body. He made a quiet promise to himself that whatever else he lost, he would not lose the part of him that still knelt down to look Ethan in the eye every single night and ask about his day. But promises are easier made than kept when the walls are closing in. By late October, the landlord's patience had run out. Daniel received a formal notice, 30 days to pay what he owed, or vacate the property. He sat at the kitchen table long after Ethan had gone to bed. The notice spread out in front of him under the dim light of a single bulb, doing math that refused to work out, no matter how many times he ran the numbers. He thought about calling his sister in another state, about asking for help, but pride and distance made the idea feel impossible. He thought about Margaret, and how she would insist on giving him money if she knew, and how he could never let that happen. She had already given so much, and he refused to be the reason her own modest savings dwindled further. For the first time since losing his job, Daniel allowed himself, alone in that kitchen, to cry. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was the quiet, exhausted kind of crying that comes from a man who has spent months being strong for everyone else and has finally run out of places to put the weight. He thought about his own father, who had worked 2 jobs for most of Daniel's childhood and never once complained, and he wondered if this was the moment every parent eventually reached, the moment when love and circumstance pulled in opposite directions, and there was no clean way to reconcile them. He thought about Ethan's laugh, the way it filled a room without effort, and how desperately he wanted to protect that laugh from ever being touched by the kind of fear currently sitting in his own chest. He didn't hear the soft knock at first. When he finally opened the door, he found Ethan standing there in his pajamas, having woken up and noticed the light still on. His son didn't ask what was wrong. He just wrapped his small arms around Daniel's waist and said, "You always tell me it's going to be okay. So it's going to be okay, right, Dad?" And Daniel, throat tight, nodded and carried his son back to bed, because some promises you keep, simply because your child is watching, to see if you will. The next morning, exhausted and hollowed out, Daniel still walked to Margaret's porch. He almost didn't. Some tired, defeated part of him wanted to stay in bed and let the world spin without him for one single day. But habit and love pulled him out the door anyway, and it turned out to be the most important decision he ever made. Margaret wasn't on the porch waiting for him like usual. Instead, there was a car in her driveway that Daniel had never seen before. Sleek, black, expensive, the kind of car that didn't belong on a street lined with modest houses and overgrown gardens. For a moment, panic surged through him. He thought something might be wrong, that paramedics had been called, that Margaret had fallen, and someone had come to help. He hurried up the porch steps 2 at a time and knocked hard on the door. It didn't open the way it always did. Slowly, with Margaret's careful, familiar shuffle audible from behind it. This time, it opened almost immediately, and standing there was not the elderly woman Daniel had come to think of as family. It was a man, tall, sharply dressed in a charcoal suit that looked like it cost more than Daniel's monthly rent, with silver threading through dark hair, and a face that carried the particular exhaustion of someone who had spent a long time being important, and a long time being unhappy about it. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then recognition crossed the man's face, and Daniel felt the floor tilt slightly beneath him, because he recognized it too. It was the same face, older and more tired now, that he'd once seen only as a shadow behind tinted glass in a parking lot 6 months earlier. It was Nathaniel Cole, the CEO who had signed off on the round of layoffs that ended Daniel's career at Cole Freight and Distribution. "You," Nathaniel said quietly, his voice edged with disbelief. "You're the man from the layoffs. Reyes, wasn't it?" Daniel's mouth went dry. Of all the ways he had imagined this moment, and there had been nights he imagined it, nights of quiet resentment he wasn't proud of, none of them looked like this. None of them involved his elderly neighbor's front door. "What are you doing here?" Daniel finally managed. Nathaniel's jaw tightened, and something unreadable passed behind his eyes. "This is my mother's house." The words landed like a physical blow. Daniel took a step back, his mind rushing to fit the pieces together. Margaret's silver hair, her brass-handled cane, her stories about a brilliant son who had built a company and forgotten the people who loved him first. He had spent months listening to Margaret talk about a boy who used to leave notes under her pillow before school, who used to bring her wildflowers from the empty lot behind their old house, who had grown into someone she barely recognized anymore. He had never once connected that boy to the man who had shaken his life apart with a single signature on a termination letter. "Is she all right?" Daniel asked, the question rising above his own shock, because whatever complicated feelings he now carried toward Nathaniel Cole, his concern for Margaret came first. Nathaniel's expression shifted, the hard executive mask slipping for just a moment, to reveal something rawer underneath. "She had a fall 3 days ago. Nothing broken, thank God. But the doctor wants her resting, and I only found out because a neighbor called me. She'd apparently kept my number, all these years, taped inside a kitchen drawer." He paused, studying Daniel's face, like he was trying to solve a puzzle. "She kept talking about you while I sat with her at the hospital. Daniel this, Daniel that. The man who brings her groceries, the man who fixed her porch step, the man who reminds her of who I used to be." His voice caught slightly on the last words. Daniel didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to walk away, to let the man stew in whatever guilt had finally caught up to him after years of silence. But another part of him, the part that had knocked on this door every single morning for months, without ever asking for anything, simply asked, "Can I see her?" Nathaniel stepped aside without a word, and Daniel walked into the small living room, where Margaret sat propped up on the couch, a blanket over her legs, her face lighting up the moment she saw him. "Daniel," she said, reaching for his hand. "You came." "Every day," he said, kneeling beside her. "Same as always." She smiled, and then her eyes flicked toward her son, standing awkwardly near the doorway, and something passed between mother and child. that had clearly been missing for a very long time. A kind of silent negotiation, an opening. "I told him about you," she said. "I told him everything." Over the next hour, in that small living room that smelled faintly of lavender and old books, the truth unfolded, piece by piece. Nathaniel admitted that the layoffs had been handled by a restructuring team. He'd approved, but never personally reviewed. A cold, distant decision made in a boardroom, disconnected from the faces and families it affected. He hadn't known Daniel's name until this moment. Hadn't known that the man his mother spoke of, with such warmth, was the same employee whose life he had upended with the stroke of a pen. He sat in stunned, uncomfortable silence as Margaret recounted, in detail, everything Daniel had quietly done for her. The groceries, the doctor's visits, the repaired step, the mornings spent simply keeping a lonely old woman company when her own son couldn't find the time. "He never asked me for a thing," Margaret said, her voice firm despite its frailty. "Not once. Do you understand how rare that is, Nathaniel? To find someone who gives without keeping score." Nathaniel looked at Daniel then, really looked at him, and Daniel saw something shift behind. The polished exterior, the recognition of a man who had spent so long building an empire that he had forgotten the foundation was supposed to be people. "I owe you an apology," Nathaniel said quietly. "Not just for the layoff, for not seeing you, for not seeing any of them. The people whose lives were just line items to me." Nathaniel sat down slowly on the arm of the couch, rubbing a hand across his jaw, looking, for the first time since Daniel had known of him only as a shadow behind glass, entirely human. "I used to visit every Sunday," he admitted, mostly to himself. "Then it became every other Sunday. Then holidays. Then phone calls that got shorter and shorter, until they were just texts. I told myself I was building something for her, for our family name, so that she'd never have to worry about money again. But I never once asked her if money was the thing she was worried about." He looked at his mother, and his voice wavered in a way that didn't match the composed executive who had opened the door 20 minutes earlier. "I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry." Margaret reached for his hand the same way she'd reached for Daniel's 100 mornings before. And for a moment, the three of them simply sat together in the quiet of that small living room, the past folding gently into something that might, with care, become a future. Daniel didn't need the apology to feel whole again. He'd already found meaning in Margaret's porch, in Ethan's small arms around his waist, in the quiet dignity of showing up every day, even when no one was watching. But he accepted it anyway, because forgiveness, he'd learned, cost him nothing, and gave the other person a chance to become better. What happened over the following weeks surprised even Daniel. Nathaniel, shaken by the mirror his mother had unknowingly held up to his life, began visiting her regularly, not out of obligation, but because he'd rediscovered something he hadn't realized he'd lost. And in an unexpected turn, he reached out to Daniel personally, not with charity, but with an offer, a newly created position at Coal Freight and Distribution, overseeing employee relations and community partnerships. A role built specifically because Nathaniel wanted someone on his team who understood what it meant to see people as people, rather than numbers on a spreadsheet. It came with a salary that erased the fear of eviction notices, benefits that meant Ethan would never again go without, and something Daniel hadn't expected to find in any job description: purpose. Daniel almost said no. Pride whispered that he didn't want anything that looked like pity. But Margaret, ever wise, took his hand one afternoon and told him that accepting help wasn't wanting Mark. It was simply allowing the same kindness he'd given so freely to finally circle back to him. "You spent months teaching my son how to be present again," she said. "Let him teach you that it's all right to receive too." So Daniel accepted. Months later, on a bright Saturday morning, Daniel stood on Margaret's porch again. Only this time, Ethan was beside him, and so was Nathaniel, the three of them helping Margaret replant the garden that had gone wild with years of neglect. It wasn't lost on anyone that the very thing they were restoring A small, overlooked patch of earth, brought back to life through patient, ordinary care, mirrored everything that had happened between them. Nathaniel began showing up on Sunday mornings again, just as he had as a boy, sometimes bringing his own briefcase full of unfinished work that he'd leave untouched in the car because, for the first time in years, he understood that some hours simply belonged to the people who had waited for them. He and Daniel became something neither of them could have predicted 6 months earlier. Not quite friends in the traditional sense, but two men bound together by an old woman's porch and the strange, humbling ways life corrects itself when given the chance. At the office, Nathaniel started a program that let employees flag colleagues who needed support, a late paycheck, a sick child, a landlord's ultimatum, so that no one else at coal, freight and distribution would ever again become a name on a list, signed away without a face attached to it. Word of the story eventually made its way through the small community, not because anyone sought attention, but because Margaret, proud and unable to keep quiet about it, told anyone who would listen about the single father who kept showing up for a lonely old widow with nothing to gain, and how that quiet loyalty had somehow found its way back around to change all of their lives. Daniel never set out to be rewarded. He set out to help because it was the right thing to do, on mornings when it would have been easier to stay in bed, on days when his own cup felt achingly empty. But that's trot to she. The strange and beautiful mathematics of real kindness. It rarely announces itself. It rarely asks for witnesses. And yet somehow, it finds its way back to the person who gave it, often through doors they never expected to open. Ethan grew up hearing that story, not as a bedtime tale, but as something lived and witnessed firsthand. That his father had been poor in money, but rich in character during the hardest season of their lives. And that character, in the end, was the only currency that never lost its value. And Margaret, in her final years, often told visitors that the best thing that ever happened to her wasn't the wealth her son had built or the company that bore her family's name. It was a knock on the door every single morning from a man who had nothing to give but his time, and who gave it anyway. If this story touched something in you, remember that the small kindnesses you offer today, the ones that feel invisible, unnoticed, unrewarded, are never wasted. They are seeds planted in soil you cannot see, and one day, in ways you never expect, they bloom. Like this video if it moved you. Subscribe for more stories like Daniel's, and leave a comment telling us about a small act of kindness that changed your life, or someone else's. Because somewhere out there, someone needs to be reminded that showing up, even when it's hard, even when no one is watching, still matters more than anything else in this world.